So there I was, getting an $85,000 fine from HOA President Karen because my daughter's treehouse was supposedly structurally unsafe and built without permits. What she didn't know is that I'm a licensed structural engineer who designed skyscrapers for 30 years, and her dangerous treehouse actually exceeds building codes by 400%. But wait until you hear how this backfired on her when the city started using my treehouse design for their new public playgrounds. If you're ready for some serious engineering justice, hit that subscribe button because this story will blow your mind. Picture this. It's a beautiful Saturday morning in Oakwood Heights, Colorado, and I'm watching my 8-year-old daughter Emma play in the treehouse I spent 6 months designing and building for her birthday. I'm Michael Chen, and for the past 30 years, I've been a licensed structural engineer specializing in seismic-resistant high-rise construction. I've designed earthquake-proof skyscrapers in California, hurricane-resistant towers in Florida, and emergency shelters that can withstand F5 tornadoes. When Emma asked for a treehouse for her 8th birthday, I didn't just grab some lumber and wing it like most dads. I approached it like any major structural project, with comprehensive engineering analysis, CAD drawings, stress calculations, and material selection that would make most commercial buildings jealous. This wasn't just a treehouse. It was a masterpiece of residential engineering that happened to be built around a 200-year-old oak tree. The design incorporated seismic dampening systems I'd developed for skyscrapers, wind load calculations based on Colorado's extreme weather patterns, and safety factors that exceeded commercial building requirements by margins most engineers would consider excessive. The foundation system used helical piers that transferred loads directly to bedrock without damaging the tree's root system. The frame was constructed with galvanized steel joints and engineered lumber rated for commercial construction. Every connection was spec'd to handle forces far beyond anything a residential treehouse would ever encounter. The railings could stop a full-grown adult running at full speed. The flooring system was designed to support a grand piano, even though the heaviest thing it would ever hold was birthday party furniture. The stairs featured non-slip treads, handrails at multiple heights, and lighting systems connected to emergency backup power. For 6 months, neighbors had watched with fascination as what appeared to be a simple treehouse project evolved into something that looked more like a precision construction site. I had surveying equipment, laser levels, concrete trucks, and specialized rigging equipment that most residential contractors had never seen. The permit applications alone required 16 different engineering drawings and structural calculations that filled a 3-inch binder. The city building department had been so impressed with the engineering that they had asked for copies of my drawings to use as examples of exemplary residential construction. 3 different architecture firms had contacted me about licensing the design for commercial playground projects. The local engineering society had featured the treehouse in their quarterly newsletter as an example of how engineering principles could be applied to enhance family recreation. Emma's friends came from across the neighborhood to play in what had quickly become known as the castle in the sky. Parents marveled at the engineering details while their children enjoyed the safest recreational structure in the county. The treehouse had become a neighborhood gathering point that brought families together and showcased what was possible when proper engineering was applied to residential projects. Then Karen Westfield moved into the house next door and decided that my daughter's engineering marvel was somehow ruining her property values and threatening neighborhood safety. Karen is 52 years old, works in pharmaceutical sales, and has that particular combination of confidence and ignorance that makes suburban tyrants particularly dangerous. She drives a white BMW X3 that she parks in different spots around the neighborhood while conducting what she calls community standards assessments. She carries a tablet and measuring tape everywhere, documenting what she perceives as violations of aesthetic and safety standards that exist primarily in her imagination. Within 2 weeks of moving in, Karen had introduced herself by commenting that my treehouse was excessive and not really appropriate for a residential neighborhood. She suggested that something more modest and traditional would be better for community harmony. I politely explained that the treehouse had been designed by a professional engineer and had received all necessary permits and inspections. Karen's response was to research HOA covenants and building codes with the dedication of someone preparing for litigation. She spent hours photographing my treehouse from different angles, measuring its dimensions, and researching structural engineering regulations that she clearly didn't understand. She was building a case against a structure that represented the pinnacle of residential safety engineering. The first violation notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, printed on official HOA letterhead and delivered by certified mail. The language was breathtaking in its technical ignorance and bureaucratic arrogance. My treehouse allegedly violated multiple building codes, safety standards, and HOA covenants. The structure was classified as an unpermitted accessory building that posed imminent safety hazards to neighborhood children. The specific violations Karen cited included improper foundation systems, non-compliant structural framing, inadequate safety railings, and excessive height and mass. The fine was $85,000, payable within 30 days, or face emergency demolitions proceedings and additional penalties. She had essentially accused the safest recreational structure in Colorado of being a death trap. I read the violation notice 3 times, each reading making me more amazed by the depth of Karen's misunderstanding of basic engineering principles. She was citing building codes that didn't apply to residential accessory structures, referencing safety standards she had clearly never read, and making structural assessments that demonstrated complete ignorance of engineering fundamentals. But this wasn't just about my treehouse. This was about the broader pattern of HOA tyrants using fake technical authority to terrorize homeowners who had invested time and resources in improving their properties. As a professional engineer, I'd seen countless examples of bureaucratic harassment disguised as safety enforcement, usually targeting people who didn't have the technical knowledge to fight back effectively. The next morning, I drove to my home office and began preparing a response that would educate Karen about the difference between actual engineering expertise and suburban bureaucratic cosplay. I pulled out the complete engineering documentation for the treehouse project, structural calculations, materials specifications, safety analyses, and professional certifications that represented thousands of hours of specialized work. The documentation package I assembled was comprehensive and devastating to Karen's amateur technical assessments. The foundation system alone had been engineered to support loads 50 times greater than anything the treehouse would ever encounter. The structural framing incorporated safety factors that exceeded commercial building requirements. The railings and safety systems had been tested to standards used for stadium construction. I called the city building department and spoke with senior structural inspector James Rodriguez, who had personally reviewed and approved my treehouse design. He listened to my description of Karen's violation notice with the controlled amusement of someone who had dealt with similar technical ignorance countless times. "Michael," he said, his voice carrying 30 years of construction industry experience, "your treehouse is the most over-engineered residential structure I've seen in my career. It's safer than most commercial buildings and exceeds every applicable code by margins that most engineers would consider excessive. This HOA president is making technical assessments that she's completely unqualified to make." Inspector Rodriguez's words were both validating and concerning. Karen wasn't just wrong about the treehouse's safety. She was demonstrating a pattern of technical misrepresentation that could affect other homeowners who didn't have professional engineering backgrounds to defend themselves. Her violation notices represented dangerous precedent for HOA overreach disguised as technical expertise. "Can you work with me to document her misrepresentations?" Rodriguez asked. "We need to establish clear boundaries about HOA authority over properly permitted and inspected structures. Your case could help protect other homeowners from similar technical harassment based on amateur assessments." I looked out my office window at the treehouse that had brought so much joy to Emma and her friends, a structure that represented everything I loved about engineering, solving problems, ensuring safety, and creating something beautiful and functional that would last for generations. The idea that someone with no technical training could threaten its demolition based on ignorant misinterpretations was both professionally insulting and personally infuriating. The response I prepared for Karen was methodical, comprehensive, and professionally devastating. I included complete structural calculations showing that the treehouse could withstand earthquake forces that would damage most houses. I provided materials certifications, demonstrating that every component exceeded commercial construction standards. I included inspection reports from 3 different city departments, confirming compliance with all applicable codes. Most importantly, I included my professional engineering credentials, 30 years of structural design experience, and a detailed technical critique of every claim in her violation notice. I explained exactly why each of her assessments was wrong, which codes she had misinterpreted, and what the actual safety factors were for each structural element she had questioned. The engineering analysis I provided was written at a level that any technically competent person could understand, but detailed enough to demonstrate the sophisticated calculations behind every design decision. I wanted Karen to understand exactly how far out of her depth she was when attempting to make structural assessments about professional engineering work. The cover letter I included was polite but firm. I explained that HOA covenants could not override building codes, that properly permitted structures were protected from arbitrary removal demands, and that making false technical assessments about engineered structures could constitute professional misrepresentation with potential legal consequences. I hand-delivered the response package to Karen's front door, along with a copy sent to the HOA board and another copy filed with the city building department. I wanted complete documentation of my technical rebuttal to her amateur engineering assessment, with multiple parties aware of the professional standards involved in the dispute. Karen's reaction to receiving 47 pages of detailed engineering documentation was predictably defensive and escalatory. Instead of acknowledging her technical errors, she doubled down on her authority claims and began researching additional regulations she could misinterpret to support her demolition demands. The second violation notice arrived 1 week later, even more technically ignorant than the first. Karen had apparently spent hours researching building codes on the internet, cherry-picking regulations from commercial construction standards, industrial safety requirements, and even aviation obstruction guidelines. She had created a Frankenstein's monster of regulatory misinterpretation, designed to make my treehouse appear dangerous to anyone who didn't understand engineering. This time, she claimed the treehouse violated FAA height restrictions for residential structures, exceeded allowable wind loads for temporary construction, and failed to meet accessibility requirements for public buildings. She had classified my daughter's backyard play structure as commercial construction subject to industrial safety standards. The ignorance behind these new claims was staggering even by Karen's previous standards. She was applying aviation regulations to a 20-foot treehouse, industrial wind load calculations to a residential structure, and ADA requirements to private family recreational equipment. She had fundamentally misunderstood the purpose and classification of everything she was attempting to regulate. I called Inspector Rodriguez immediately and read him Karen's new technical assessments. His response was immediate and professionally outraged. This woman is now making regulatory claims that demonstrate complete ignorance of basic building classification and code applicability. She's creating public safety hazards by providing false technical information about properly engineered structures. The documentation of Karen's escalating technical misrepresentations became the foundation for a formal complaint about HOA overreach and potential professional misrepresentation. Inspector Rodriguez connected me with City Attorney Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in construction law and regulatory enforcement. We began building a case that would establish clear limits on HOA technical authority and protect other homeowners from similar harassment. But Karen made one crucial mistake that would end her technical terrorism campaign permanently. She hired a demolition company to conduct an emergency safety assessment of my treehouse while I was attending an engineering conference in Denver. She convinced them that the structure posed imminent danger to neighborhood children and required immediate professional evaluation. I received a frantic call from my neighbor, Dr. Patricia Santos, a retired physics professor who understood structural engineering principles. "Michael," she said, her voice tight with concern, "there are men with measuring equipment on your property taking photographs of Emma's treehouse. They say they're conducting a safety assessment for emergency demolition. I called the police, but they claim they have proper authorization." I immediately contacted city building enforcement and reported unauthorized assessment of a permitted structure. Within minutes, building inspectors were coordinating with police to investigate what amounted to potential trespassing and false representation of technical authority. My security cameras captured everything, Karen directing unlicensed assessors to evaluate professionally engineered construction. The The response from city officials was swift and comprehensive. Building enforcement officers arrived with emergency stop work orders and demanded to see the professional credentials of anyone conducting structural assessments. The demolition company found themselves explaining their qualifications to evaluate engineering that they were completely unqualified to assess. Karen's response to official intervention was predictably delusional. She insisted that HOA authority superseded building department jurisdiction and that properly permitted structures could be demolished based on amateur safety assessments. She demanded to see official warrants while standing next to unlicensed evaluators with measuring equipment on private property. Her ignorance was spectacular and legally problematic. City officials patiently explained that building codes superseded HOA covenants, that structural assessments required professional engineering credentials, and that interfering with permitted construction could result in civil and criminal penalties. They documented Karen's false technical claims and unauthorized property access. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Karen's technical misrepresentation campaign. Her computer contained research files on dozens of residential improvement projects throughout the neighborhood, with detailed plans for challenging structures based on regulations she didn't understand. She had been studying building codes not to ensure compliance, but to find pretexts for demanding removal of improvements she personally disliked. What city investigators discovered in Karen's files was both disturbing and legally significant. She had been operating a systematic campaign against residential improvements using false technical authority and regulatory misrepresentation. Her computer systems contained databases of neighborhood projects with comprehensive attack strategies that read like military intelligence targeting civilian infrastructure. Karen's operation had identified over 50 residential improvement projects that she classified as regulatory violation opportunities, meaning structures that could be challenged through creative misinterpretation of building codes regardless of their actual safety or compliance status. She had researched each project's technical specifications, permit history, and the technical knowledge levels of property owners to identify the most vulnerable targets. The harassment network she had assembled included corrupt building inspectors willing to cite false violations, dishonest contractors who would provide negative assessments of properly engineered work, and administrative assistants who could file frivolous complaints through official channels. Her goal was to create bureaucratic terrorism that would force homeowners to remove improvements that she personally found objectionable. Her financial records revealed that the technical harassment enterprise was profitable through kickbacks from contractors who benefited when homeowners were forced to demolish existing improvements and hire new construction services. Karen had been receiving payments for each successful removal she accomplished, with bonuses based on the complexity and cost of the improvements destroyed. The psychological evaluation ordered by city attorneys revealed a personality profile that combined technical inadequacy with authoritarian control needs. Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in regulatory abuse cases, described Karen as displaying engineering envy disorder, a pathological resentment of technical competence combined with compulsive needs to control engineering decisions she didn't understand. Karen's personal journals, discovered during the investigation, provided chilling insights into her motivations and methods. She wrote about engineered structures with contempt and fear, describing them as showing off and making other houses look inadequate. She celebrated each successful demolition like a victory over technical expertise that threatened her authority. One particularly disturbing entry described her strategy for targeting families with children who had invested heavily in backyard improvement projects. Karen had researched the emotional attachments families developed to recreational structures, then timed her harassment campaigns to coincide with birthdays and holidays when demolition demands would cause maximum psychological distress. Another journal entry detailed her campaign against an elderly couple who had installed a wheelchair ramp using professional engineering design. Karen had studied accessibility regulations until she found obscure technical requirements that she could misinterpret to challenge the safety and compliance of structures specifically designed to help disabled residents access their homes. The city's investigation expanded as more victims of Karen's technical harassment came forward. She had previously targeted the owners of a professionally designed gazebo, a permitted workshop building, and an engineered retaining wall. Each campaign had followed the same pattern. research legitimate regulations, misinterpret technical requirements, demand demolition based on false assessments. The common thread was Karen's systematic targeting of families who had invested professional expertise and significant resources in improving their properties. She specifically chose projects that represented technical competence beyond her understanding, then weaponized regulatory complexity to create harassment campaigns disguised as safety enforcement. The civil lawsuit I filed against Karen and her network expanded dramatically as investigators uncovered the full scope of her technical harassment conspiracy. What began as a treehouse violation case evolved into a complex lawsuit targeting multiple defendants, including corrupt inspectors, dishonest contractors, and administrative personnel who had participated in systematic regulatory abuse. The expert witnesses who testified during the proceedings painted a devastating picture of how technical harassment threatened residential improvement and property investment. Dr. Richard Santos, a leading authority on construction law, explained how Karen's campaigns undermined the professional engineering and building inspection systems that protected public safety. Professional engineers and licensed contractors testified about the chilling effect of Karen's harassment on residential improvement projects. When homeowners couldn't trust that properly designed and permitted structures would be protected from arbitrary removal demands, investment in quality construction and professional design services decreased, ultimately reducing neighborhood property values and safety standards. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from building officials who had witnessed Karen's escalating technical misrepresentations and false regulatory claims. Inspector Rodriguez provided detailed analysis of each technical error in Karen's assessments, demonstrating that her claims were not merely wrong, but dangerously misleading about actual safety conditions. The trial became a showcase for the importance of professional engineering credentials and the dangers of allowing unqualified individuals to make technical assessments about structural safety. The prosecution presented evidence of Karen's systematic campaign against multiple properly engineered residential improvements, her financial incentives for causing demolitions, and her sophisticated methods for exploiting regulatory complexity to terrorize families who had invested in professional design services. Karen's defense team, led by prominent construction law attorney Daniel Brooks, tried to portray her as a concerned community member who was simply trying to ensure neighborhood safety through diligent enforcement of building codes. They argued that she had legitimate concerns about structures that might not meet all applicable regulations, and that her removal demands were motivated by genuine safety considerations rather than personal animosity toward engineering excellence. This defense strategy began to collapse during cross-examination when federal prosecutors introduced evidence of Karen's specific research into property values, her documented resentment of engineering expertise, and her financial relationships with contractors who benefited from forced demolitions. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Maria Santos, methodically dismantled Karen's claims of innocent community management by presenting her own written communications about targeting over-engineered residential improvements. The prosecution demonstrated that Karen had never targeted structures with actual safety problems or code violations, despite numerous genuine hazards existing throughout the neighborhood. Her harassment campaigns were specifically designed to force removal of properly engineered improvements that enhanced property values and showcased technical competence beyond her understanding. Her technical assessments were fabricated to create pretexts for demolition demands rather than address legitimate safety issues. Most damaging were Karen's own emails and text messages, recovered through digital forensics, where she discussed her strategies with criminal associates and expressed explicit resentment toward homeowners who could afford professional engineering services. One particularly incriminating exchange showed Karen instructing a corrupt building inspector to find something wrong with my treehouse design, acknowledging that the structure was probably safer than most houses. The jury was particularly influenced by testimony from families who had been victimized by Karen's technical harassment campaigns before my case brought her activities to official attention. The Martinez family described watching their children's disappointment when a professionally designed playground structure they had saved for years to build was threatened with demolition based on Karen's false technical assessments. Robert and Linda Chen testified about the financial stress of defending a permitted workshop building against regulatory challenges they couldn't afford to fight. Karen had targeted their retirement project with fabricated structural concerns that required expensive professional rebuttals, ultimately forcing them to abandon their dream of a home woodworking business because the legal costs of defending proper engineering exceeded their fixed income. Most heartbreaking was testimony from Eleanor Patterson, an 82-year-old widow whose wheelchair ramp had been targeted by Karen's regulatory harassment. Mrs. Patterson had invested her late husband's life insurance proceeds in a professionally engineered accessibility system that enabled her to remain in their family home. Karen's false technical assessments about the ramp's safety had created months of bureaucratic terror for an elderly woman whose mobility depended on the structure. The prosecution's expert witnesses provided devastating technical analysis of Karen's systematic misrepresentation of engineering principles and regulatory requirements. Dr. Patricia Williams, professor of structural engineering at Colorado State University, explained how Karen's assessments demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of load calculations, safety factors, and building code applicability. Dr. Williams used visual presentations to show the jury exactly how Karen's technical claims contradicted basic engineering principles. Using scale models and computer simulations, she demonstrated that structures Karen had condemned as unsafe actually exceeded safety requirements by margins that most commercial buildings would envy. The educational impact was profound as jury members learned to recognize the difference between qualified technical assessment and amateur regulatory interpretation. The financial investigation conducted by forensic accountant Michael Rodriguez revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation Karen had established to hide criminal proceeds from her technical harassment enterprise. The scheme had generated over $480,000 in illegal revenue over 3 years through a complex network of shell companies, kickback arrangements, and fraudulent consulting contracts designed to obscure the source of funds. Karen's operation had established fake engineering consulting businesses, phantom safety inspection services, and fraudulent regulatory compliance companies that enabled systematic wealth extraction from technical harassment while avoiding detection by financial institutions. Rodriguez explained how Karen had studied white-collar crime techniques to create an enterprise that appeared legitimate to casual observers while generating substantial illegal profits from residential improvement destruction. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court provided disturbing insights into Karen's motivations for targeting engineering excellence and professional technical competence. Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in regulatory abuse cases, described Karen as displaying competence displacement disorder, a pathological need to destroy evidence of professional expertise that threatened her authority within the community. Karen's personal journals, seized during the investigation, revealed systematic documentation of her resentment toward families who invested in professional design services and quality construction. She wrote about engineered structures with contempt and envy, describing them as showing off and making normal houses look cheap. She celebrated each successful demolition as a victory over technical competence that challenged her community leadership. One particularly disturbing entry described her strategy for targeting families during vulnerable periods when demolition demands would cause maximum emotional distress. Karen had researched personal circumstances, job losses, medical crises, educational expenses, then timed her harassment campaigns to coincide with periods when families could least afford legal battles over properly engineered improvements. Another journal entry detailed her systematic study of engineering terminology and regulatory language, not to understand technical principles, but to create more convincing false assessments that could intimidate homeowners who lacked engineering backgrounds. She had developed a library of technical-sounding phrases that masked her fundamental ignorance of structural engineering principles. The international scope of Karen's research shocked even experienced prosecutors. Her computer systems contained correspondence with similar technical harassment networks operating in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, sharing strategies for challenging residential engineering projects and avoiding prosecution for regulatory misrepresentation. These international connections had provided Karen with sophisticated techniques for creating technical crises while maintaining plausible deniability. Dr. Heinrich Müller, an expert in international construction fraud, testified via video link about similar cases his organization had investigated across multiple countries. He described how criminal networks like Karen's represented a growing international threat to residential engineering excellence, with organized syndicates that treated professional technical competence as obstacles to bureaucratic control rather than essential safety resources. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from building officials who had witnessed Karen's escalating technical misrepresentations and false regulatory claims over multiple years. Chief Building Inspector James Rodriguez provided detailed analysis of every technical error in Karen's assessments, demonstrating that her claims were not merely wrong, but systematically designed to undermine confidence in professional engineering services. Inspector Rodriguez's presentation included side-by-side comparisons of Karen's amateur assessments with actual professional engineering reports for the same structures. The contrasts were stark and educationally powerful. Where qualified engineers provided precise calculations and safety verifications, Karen offered vague concerns and misapplied regulations that demonstrated complete ignorance of structural engineering principles. The testimony from construction industry professionals revealed how Karen's campaigns had created broader chilling effects on residential improvement projects throughout the region. Contractors reported that homeowners were increasingly reluctant to invest in professional design services when properly engineered structures could be targeted for arbitrary removal based on amateur technical assessments. Licensed engineers testified about declining demand for residential consulting services as families chose cheaper alternatives rather than risk having professionally designed improvements challenged by unqualified regulatory harassment. The economic impact extended throughout the construction industry as quality engineering services were replaced by minimal compliance approaches that reduced safety margins and long-term structural performance. The expert testimony about engineering education and professional licensing helped the jury understand why Karen's technical assessments were not merely incorrect, but dangerously misleading about actual safety conditions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, director of the National Society of Professional Engineers, explained the years of education, testing, and experience required to make qualified structural assessments. Dr. Mitchell's presentation included detailed comparisons between the rigorous professional standards required for engineering licensure and the complete absence of qualifications behind Karen's technical claims. She emphasized that public safety depended on maintaining clear distinctions between qualified professional assessment and amateur regulatory interpretation, regardless of how convincing the latter might appear to non-technical audiences. The prosecution's closing arguments, delivered by District Attorney Santos, focused on the systematic nature of Karen's technical fraud and the necessity of serious criminal penalties to protect residential engineering from organized regulatory harassment. Santos emphasized that Karen's crimes represented attacks on the professional engineering systems that ensured public safety and enabled quality residential construction. Santos presented a comprehensive timeline of Karen's escalating technical misrepresentations, from her initial amateur assessments of individual structures to her sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting professional engineering throughout multiple communities. The visual presentation made clear that Karen's activities constituted organized fraud rather than isolated regulatory disputes. The defense's closing arguments, delivered by Attorney Brooks, focused on Karen's lack of formal technical training and argued that her mistakes were products of good intentions rather than criminal intent. Brooks portrayed Karen as an overwhelmed volunteer who had made errors in regulatory interpretation while trying to maintain community safety standards through diligent enforcement of building codes. This argument was undermined by the extensive evidence of Karen's financial motivation, systematic planning, and deliberate targeting of professionally engineered structures for removal. The jury had seen clear documentation that Karen's campaigns were calculated, profitable, and specifically designed to destroy technical excellence rather than address genuine safety concerns. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 federal and state charges. Karen Westfield was convicted of technical fraud, professional misrepresentation, criminal conspiracy, systematic harassment, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise targeting residential engineering projects. Her conviction carried mandatory sentences totaling 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Judge Patricia Rodriguez's sentencing statement became a landmark precedent for technical harassment prosecution. She explained that regulatory abuse targeting professional engineering required severe penalties because such crimes undermined the technical systems that protected public safety and enabled quality residential construction. The judge noted that Karen's sophisticated criminal enterprise had threatened to eliminate professional engineering from residential improvement projects. The financial penalties were comprehensive and devastating. Karen was ordered to pay complete replacement costs for all improvements that had been demolished due to her false technical assessments, totaling over $680,000 for professionally designed structures across dozens of properties. The restitution included premium costs for historically accurate restoration and enhanced engineering that exceeded original specifications. All of Karen's personal and business assets were subject to criminal forfeiture, including her house, BMW X3, business interests, investment accounts, and even personal jewelry purchased with criminal proceeds. The total value of forfeited assets exceeded $420,000, with proceeds distributed to victimized families and used to fund enhanced protection for residential engineering projects. The broader impact of Karen's prosecution created revolutionary changes in how regulatory agencies approach technical harassment and protect professional engineering from amateur interference. The state legislature passed the Professional Engineering Protection Act, creating specialized enforcement units dedicated exclusively to investigating false technical assessments and prosecuting regulatory abuse targeting qualified engineering services. The legislation established mandatory penalties of 5 years imprisonment for technical fraud, 10 years for systematic harassment of engineering projects, and up to 20 years for organized criminal enterprises that targeted professional engineering through regulatory manipulation. These penalties reflected legislative recognition that attacks on engineering competence threatened public safety and economic development. Building departments throughout Colorado implemented new protocols for verifying the credentials of anyone making technical assessments about residential improvements and protecting properly permitted structures from arbitrary challenges based on amateur regulatory interpretation. These protocols created systematic barriers against technical harassment while maintaining legitimate oversight of construction activities. Professional engineering organizations developed comprehensive legal defense funds for members facing regulatory harassment, educational programs for recognizing and preventing technical fraud, and advocacy resources for protecting engineering competence from bureaucratic attack. These initiatives created institutional support for individual engineers while strengthening professional standards. The educational impact extended throughout technical education programs as universities began offering specialized courses on regulatory compliance, technical communication, and legal protection for engineering services. Students learned to document their work comprehensively, communicate technical concepts to non-engineering audiences, and protect their professional assessments from misrepresentation. Corporate engineering firms established specialized legal departments for handling regulatory disputes and protecting technical assessments from amateur challenge. These departments provided systematic defense against technical harassment, while maintaining positive relationships with legitimate regulatory agencies that supported professional engineering competence. Our neighborhood transformation after Karen's prosecution became a model for community-based support of professional engineering and quality residential construction. Property values increased by an average of 28% as families regained confidence that investments in professional design services would be protected from arbitrary regulatory challenges. The treehouse that had started Karen's harassment campaign became a symbol of successful defense against technical fraud and the importance of maintaining professional engineering standards. Emma's childhood fortress attracted visitors from engineering schools, regulatory agencies, and legal organizations who wanted to study the intersection of professional competence and regulatory protection. The Michael Chen Engineering Defense Foundation, established using settlement funds and professional organization grants, grew into a premier resource for engineers facing regulatory harassment, and homeowners seeking protection for professional design services. The Foundation's legal clinic provided free representation for technical harassment cases, while its educational programs trained thousands of people about recognizing qualified engineering credentials. The Foundation's research division conducted groundbreaking studies on the economic impacts of technical harassment, the effectiveness of professional engineering education, and the regulatory frameworks that best protected technical competence while maintaining legitimate oversight. Their research influenced policy development at state and national levels. 5 years after Karen's conviction, the annual Professional Engineering Rights Conference held at our community center had become the premier gathering for structural engineers, regulatory officials, legal professionals, and homeowners interested in protecting technical competence from bureaucratic harassment. The conference attracted over 2,200 participants annually and generated policy recommendations that influence professional standards and legal frameworks. The National Technical Competence Database, established by the Foundation, became the primary tool for tracking false engineering assessments and identifying individuals who repeatedly made unqualified technical claims about professional engineering work. Regulatory agencies use the database to verify credentials and identify patterns indicating systematic technical harassment. Emergency response protocols developed through our experience enabled rapid deployment of professional engineering resources when technical harassment threats were identified. Streamlined procedures allowed qualified engineers to obtain protective court orders within hours, while specialized legal teams could intervene before amateur assessments could cause irreversible damage to professional reputations or properly engineered structures. Training academies funded through legislation provided specialized education for regulatory officials, legal professionals, and community leaders who worked on technical assessment cases. These academies graduated over 1,800 specialists who understood the importance of maintaining clear distinctions between qualified engineering assessment and amateur technical opinions. The digital documentation systems developed by the Foundation created comprehensive archives of professional engineering work that could be accessed immediately when technical harassment occurred. These systems enabled rapid response to false assessments, while maintaining detailed records of engineering competence for future protection needs. Corporate accountability measures implemented through advocacy established professional engineering review as standard requirement for any regulatory challenge to permitted structures designed by licensed engineers. Agencies were required to demonstrate that their assessments were based on qualified technical analysis rather than amateur interpretation of regulatory requirements. Community resilience programs taught neighborhoods how to recognize qualified engineering credentials, support families investing in professional design services, and coordinate with regulatory agencies when technical harassment was identified. Over 400 communities implemented these programs, creating grassroots networks that provided early warning systems against amateur technical interference. Legal precedents established through Karen's prosecution were cited in over 180 subsequent technical harassment cases, creating consistent enforcement standards and predictable consequences for regulatory abuse targeting professional engineering competence. Judges now had clear guidelines for sentencing technical fraud, and prosecutors understood the resources available for investigating systematic harassment of engineering services. The public awareness campaigns launched through Foundation initiatives educated millions of people about recognizing technical competence, understanding professional engineering credentials, and accessing resources for protecting qualified technical assessments from amateur regulatory interference. These campaigns fundamentally changed public understanding of professional engineering and created widespread support for protecting technical excellence. International cooperation agreements developed through our case established binding protocols between engineering organizations worldwide for sharing information about technical harassment and coordinating professional defense against regulatory abuse. These agreements created legal mechanisms for supporting engineers facing systematic technical fraud while maintaining professional standards across national boundaries. The technology innovations sponsored by the Foundation revolutionized protection capabilities through automated monitoring systems that tracked regulatory filings for patterns indicating technical harassment, blockchain verification systems that created tamper-proof records of professional engineering credentials, and mobile applications that enabled immediate access to qualified engineering assessments. Regulatory reforms advocated through professional organizations strengthened protection for licensed engineers while maintaining legitimate oversight of construction activities. New requirements mandated that any challenge to professional engineering work must be based on equivalent technical credentials, with civil and criminal penalties for agencies that permitted amateur technical assessments to override qualified professional analysis. 10 years after Karen first threatened Emma's treehouse, I received an invitation to address the International Professional Engineering Protection Assembly about sustainable approaches to defending technical competence in regulatory environments. The speech was part of a global initiative to establish universal standards for protecting professional engineering from systematic harassment by amateur regulatory interpretation. The Assembly adopted the Chen Protocols, named after our successful defense against technical harassment, which established mandatory procedures for investigating regulatory abuse, targeting professional engineering, and supporting qualified technical professionals facing amateur challenges. These protocols required participating organizations to maintain specialized technical harassment response units and provide comprehensive legal defense for professional engineering competence. The economic research conducted by our foundation revealed that protecting professional engineering generated exponential financial benefits through enhanced safety standards, improved construction quality, increased property values, and reduced liability exposure from inadequate technical assessments. Communities with comprehensive engineering protection programs showed average economic growth rates 35% higher than areas where professional technical competence faced regular regulatory challenges. Corporate partnerships developed through the foundation revolutionized funding mechanisms for professional engineering defense, while creating market advantages for companies that invested in qualified technical services. Major engineering firms now provide specialized legal support. Financial institutions offer professional liability protection, and technology companies sponsor research into technical harassment prevention as part of corporate responsibility initiatives. Educational curriculum developed from our experience is now taught in engineering schools, legal programs, and regulatory training courses at over 350 universities worldwide. Students learn about technical harassment recognition, professional competence protection, and regulatory frameworks that support engineering excellence while maintaining appropriate oversight of construction activities. The mentorship program established through foundation initiatives has trained over 1,600 engineering advocates who work in communities across 34 states, providing local expertise for protecting professional technical competence, educating property owners about qualified engineering services, and coordinating with regulatory agencies when amateur assessments threaten legitimate professional work. Legacy planning services developed by the foundation help engineering professionals create sustainable career protection arrangements that defend technical competence across decades of professional practice. These services include legal structures, professional insurance programs, and advocacy networks that ensure qualified engineers remain protected even when facing systematic regulatory harassment. The satisfaction of this victory extends far beyond personal vindication to encompass the knowledge that our struggle created permanent protection for engineering excellence and technical competence that will benefit countless professionals and families for generations to come. The legal frameworks, educational resources, and institutional support developed through our experience will protect professional engineering long after current practitioners have retired. Every properly engineered structure represents a victory for technical competence over amateur regulatory interference, for professional standards over bureaucratic harassment, and for families who deserve the safety and quality that only qualified engineering services can provide. The tools now exist to defend professional competence against any regulatory challenge, regardless of how sophisticated or persistent the amateur interference may become. My morning routine in our backyard has become a meditation on the power of professional competence and principled resistance to technical fraud. As I drink coffee while watching Emma's friends play safely in the treehouse that started this whole battle, I reflect on how defending professional engineering grew into a movement that protects technical excellence worldwide. The treehouse itself has become a symbol of successful engineering defense, featured in professional journals, educational programs, and news articles that inspire other communities facing similar regulatory challenges. Visitors from around the world come to see how qualified technical professionals can defeat systematic harassment through competence, documentation, and strategic legal defense. Share your engineering harassment story in the comments below, because every successful defense of professional technical competence strengthens the global network that protects qualified engineering services from amateur regulatory interference. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that professional engineering deserves protection from technical fraud and systematic harassment. Your professionally engineered improvements, whether they're residential structures, commercial projects, or any other investment in technical excellence, deserve protection from those who would challenge qualified competence through amateur regulatory interpretation. The legal tools, professional resources, and institutional support now exist to defend every properly engineered project from technical harassment. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where professional engineering excellence always defeats amateur regulatory harassment through technical competence and principled resistance to systematic interference with qualified professional services.